You are not likely to have heard of Gaius Scribonius, and frankly, if you had lived in his time, you would have done your best not to. His job was to manage regional communications between minor Roman outposts in Cisalpine Gaul and the Senate. In Rome, his tool, parchment; his power, ink and delay. The Roman Empire, in its terrifying grandeur, was not built overnight. It was not even built by generals, at least not entirely. Much of it was assembled by men like Scribonius, who sat for decades inside stone buildings, drafting reports that were rarely read, and rubber-stamping troop deployments with the enthusiasm of a man filling out a grain requisition for the 5th time that morning. But in a narrow window between 58 and 56 BCE, something very unbureaucratic happened. Gaius Scribonius failed to submit a form. To understand why that mattered and how it eventually spared thousands of lives, we must first understand the Forma. 122a, an unremarkable but essential piece of parchment in the Roman military apparatus. This form, standardized in the latter days of the Republic, was used to officially approve troop reinforcements, grain movement, and construction of auxiliary roads. Without it, armies sat still, forts went unbuilt, and most crucially, generals had to wait. And in 58 BCE, the general in question was none other than Julius Caesar, freshly appointed governor of Cisalpine Gaul. Caesar, ambitious and increasingly intolerant of tedium, had begun planning his aggressive expansion into Transalpine Gaul. He needed bridges built. He needed supply lines confirmed. He needed the blessing of Rome to move more troops northward. But the Forma 122a, never arrived. It wasn't sabotage. Scribonius was not a revolutionary. In fact, he was something far more disruptive. He was careful. Unlike many Roman administrators, Scribonius was obsessed with process. He checked every name, cross-referenced troop numbers with grain storage reports, and sent inquiries to local magistrates when he found discrepancies in cattle records. His office in Bononia, modern Bologna, was rumored to contain a full filing system of every known legionnaire's travel rations for the past 3 years. The man loved the tedium. He fed on it. So when the Forma 122a came to his desk, authorizing Caesar to reroute thousands of men and countless wagons of supplies through the northern territories, Scribonius paused. A column had been left blank. It was a small thing, barely, worth noticing. The column was meant to list the total number of draft animals required for the legion's secondary baggage line. Caesar's scribes, rushed and possibly distracted by a minor skirmish in a nearby province, had left it empty. Scribonius did not ignore the omission. He sent the form back, requesting clarification. This, in bureaucratic terms, was the equivalent of halting the tides. Back in Ravenna, Caesar fumed. His men were prepared, maps had been drawn, messengers had been dispatched. But the Roman bureaucracy had spoken. Without that piece of paper, movement was unauthorized. And Caesar, though rarely prone to waiting, chose for once not to press his luck. The delay lasted 6 weeks. In that time, several Gallic tribes in the north formed an unexpected alliance, one that, had Caesar attacked immediately, would have disintegrated under Roman force. But given time, they reached a shaky peace among themselves and disbanded. When Caesar eventually marched north, his army met only token resistance. Entire regions fell without bloodshed. Historians tend to credit Caesar's brilliance for this. Smooth campaign. Few ever mention Scribonius. Fewer still realize that it was not strategy, but a missing number on a form that bought the peace. During these 6 weeks of delay, Scribonius continued his work undisturbed. He reviewed census reports, he filed grain requisitions, he made several formal complaints about the new ink supply, which he felt dried too quickly. In short, he went about his job, unaware that his fastidiousness had possibly spared an entire region from war. This was not an isolated event in Scribonius's career. Earlier records show similar patterns: forms returned due to ink smudges, resupply requests delayed due to unclear scribal markings, troop movements frozen due to inconsistent seal placements. He did not see himself as obstructing power. He was safeguarding order. And order, as it turns out, is often history's most unsung peacekeeper. Even Caesar, Once he received the corrected form and authorization to proceed, never questioned the delay. In later letters, he would reference provincial efficiency in sarcastic tones, but he never named Scribonius. In all likelihood, he never knew who caused the holdup. The machine of Roman bureaucracy was too large, too decentralized. Scribonius was a cog, but sometimes a single cog can stall an empire. By the end of his life, Scribonius had authored nearly 7,000 pages of reports. He left no memoirs, no known correspondence, and no recorded children. His only legacy is a small stone slab found in what was once Bononia, listing his full title and years of service. Gaius Scribonius, curator of forms, keeper of grain records, servant of the Senate, 39 years of service, a quiet man, a boring life, but perhaps one of the most consequential delays in Roman military history. And yet, we might wonder, if a single missing number could delay an empire, how many other wars, conflicts, and calamities were born or prevented not by strategy or sword, but by ink? If you were a Greek sailor in the 7th century BCE, navigating the jagged coastlines of the Aegean, you'd know a few simple rules of survival. 1. Stay away from unfamiliar islands. 2. Never underestimate the sea gods. And 3. Perhaps the most important, don't annoy the gods, especially the ones who look like they've had too much wine. But this wasn't just another superstition. These were practical observations passed down like sacred texts among crews who'd seen too much and talked too little. The world they knew was soaked in salt and myth, and sometimes those two things merged like sweat into fabric. That brings us back to the man who dozed calmly on the wooden planks of a Tyrrhenian pirate ship, dressed like a nobleman but barefoot, holding a bunch of grapes and smiling in his sleep. The pirates didn't think much of it. Let's pick up where we left off. The Tyrrhenian pirates, a band of seafarers from central Italy, had plied the Mediterranean for years. They raided ports, kidnapped nobles, and traded humans like wine amphorae. When they saw the delicate, rich-looking youth wandering, alone near the shore, they saw Prophet. He looked disoriented. The truth, of course, is that he had simply wandered away from a Dionysian procession after drinking a bit too much and falling asleep among the ivy. They dragged him aboard like loot and tied him up with ropes that, curiously, kept slipping away, like water from a cupped hand. One sailor swore the bindings turned into vines. Another claimed he heard the youth murmur something in a language no one on board understood, a tongue older than cities, perhaps older than the sea itself. But the captain didn't care. He was certain they'd caught a Thracian prince or some wealthy aristocrat. He ordered the man locked in the hold until they could sell him on the slave market in Naxos or Mytilene. They were, in that moment, unaware of two things. First, they had not captured a prince. Second, their ship had stopped, moving, despite the wind. The Mediterranean is many things: unforgiving, treacherous, myth-stained, but it obeyed the laws of wind and wave, except on this day, on this ship. The sails were full, the oars pushed deep into the water, and yet the ship remained still. The pirates shouted, swore, and threw blame like dice until one of them, probably the youngest, pointed toward the mast. There, entwined like ivy, were vines, grapevines to be exact, lush and fruit-laden, curling around the ropes and beams, blooming impossibly fast. Some vines coiled around the oars and into the water, where dolphins began circling the hull. This was no normal growth. This was something divine, something old. Some of the men began to panic. One claimed to hear flutes. Another whispered of a perfume in the air, sweet, floral, intoxicating. The prisoner, still tied, or so they thought, was now sitting cross-legged, on the deck calmly sipping wine from a cup that hadn't been there before. The captain, attempting to assert dominance over this strange turn of events, walked up to him and demanded his name. "I am Dionysus," the man said quietly. "Born twice and feared once." Now it's easy to imagine this as myth, the kind of tale passed down from poet to playwright, embroidered with drama and theatrical flair. But let's focus on what this story might have meant to the ordinary sailors of the Mediterranean. Dionysus wasn't just a god of wine and revelry. He was a symbol of transformation, of chaos disrupting order, of boundaries being dissolved between mortal and divine, between civilization and wilderness. His myths were cautionary tales not only about indulgence, but about respect. In rural Greece, his worship was seasonal. Farmers held festivals not just to drink, but to survive winter. His cult was associated with frenzy, masks, altered states, tools not of madness, but of resilience. Dionysian rites allowed communities to temporarily dissolve the strict hierarchies of polis life and access something primal, something healing. But to the sailors who'd captured him, Dionysus was just a man until the ship began to twist. It is said the god rose without standing, his form swelling, his eyes glowing not with anger, but pity. The pirates cried out, but found their mouths filled with brine, their legs buckled, their bodies shrinking, reshaping. Dolphins, each and every one of them. The Tyrrhenians leapt from the deck into the sea not out of desperation but compulsion. It wasn't punishment, some say, but liberation, freedom from the greed and brutality of their lives. Dolphins, after all, were sacred to many Greek gods, but especially to Dionysus, playful, mysterious, and often seen accompanying ships as omens. Only the helmsman was spared. In every version of the myth, this detail remains consistent. He had tried to stop the capture, had begged his comrades to recognize the divine in their midst. For his piety, he was saved, and likely terrified out of ever sailing again. After the pirates turned dolphins vanished into the sea, the ship righted itself and sailed smoothly. Dionysus reclined at the bow, smiling, sipping, eyes half closed. But why was he asleep in the first place? This is where boring history meets the haunting murmur of myth. Some scholars argue that the myth reflects the spread of Dionysus's cult across the Mediterranean. The god asleep represents how his faith was often dismissed by early Greeks, especially those of aristocratic or rational leanings. But no matter how much elites scorned him, Dionysus kept returning, like the tide, like intoxication, like dreams. His presence on the pirate ship may have symbolized the inevitable arrival of chaos and transformation, even among the lawless. Perhaps the pirates thought themselves untouchable until they captured a sleeping god. Today, archaeologists have discovered depictions of this myth on countless vases and amphorae. It was a story that resonated, especially in an age when piracy, slavery, and divine uncertainty were daily realities. Imagine being a dock worker in Athens, eating a meager lunch, staring at a vase showing a barefoot man, dolphins leaping, pirates screaming. You would know. Don't underestimate strangers, especially the quiet ones with ivy in their hair. And as for Dionysus, what does a god of revelry do when he needs rest? He sleeps. Even gods get tired. But when they awaken, they remind the world that joy, madness, freedom, and fear all live on the same vine. And that leads us to an unanswered question. If Dionysus was powerful enough to turn pirates into dolphins, why did he let himself be captured in the first place? So far, you've heard of a barefoot stranger who dozed beneath the sun, was bound by pirates, and turned his captors into dolphins with a gentle smile and a few swaying vines. You've seen wine spill where there was none, sails catch wind that wouldn't move, and ordinary men transformed into oceanic mammals, sentenced to leap forever through the waves like mirthful penitents. But we're not done. Dionysus did not just come to the ship to teach a lesson. His nap, his silence, and even his choice of vessel were part of a longer, older pattern. A story woven not just through Greek myth, but into the very heart of what it meant to be alive in the ancient Mediterranean world. Because behind every tale of a god is a story of the people who made him real. Let us step backward. Long before the pirate ship, long before the vines curled across timber and flutes hummed on the breeze, Dionysus had already died. Or rather, he had already been torn apart. According to the Orphic tradition, a mystical version of Greek myth, Dionysus was the son of Zeus and Persephone. As a child, he was given toys, a mirror, dice, and knuckle bones. Then the Titans came. They distracted him, tore him to pieces, and boiled the fragments. Zeus, enraged, incinerated the Titans with a thunderbolt. From their ashes rose humanity, and from Dionysus, he was reborn. This cycle, death and rebirth, madness and clarity, became central to his identity. Dionysus was the god who could not be contained. He represented a kind of sacred unraveling. Every time he died, he returned, sometimes through the womb of Semele, a mortal woman incinerated by Zeus's full glory, sometimes through fire, sometimes through wine. Always he came back. Even in sleep, he was only waiting. So when he lay on the pirate ship, surrounded by men who underestimated him, it wasn't a moment of vulnerability. It was a familiar pose. The world forgets. Dionysus waits. Most gods in the ancient world had fixed domains. Apollo ruled prophecy, the sun, and order. Poseidon claimed the sea and earthquakes. Hades ruled the underworld. But Dionysus, he was a liminal god, a god of the in-between. He was the god of transitions, of thresholds. He belonged to the wilderness, and the city, to the winepress and the battlefield. He blurred gender, status, and mental states. His worshippers, women, foreigners, slaves, were often those excluded from public life. His festivals were noisy, subversive, and ecstatic. They turned the normal world inside out. The pirate ship, then, was the perfect stage, a place beyond polis and law, full of men who lived by their own rules. But even there, in that unmoored world, Dionysus found them, and reminded them that no one, no matter how free they felt, was beyond the reach of the divine. He did it not through rage or punishment. He simply awoke. It's worth pausing here to consider something. Seemingly minor, wine. To the modern world, wine is a drink, a luxury, a dinner accompaniment, a symbol of taste. But to the ancients, it was far more. Wine was transformation in a bottle, a grape turned to liquid, fermented by time, changed into something intoxicating and strange. It was a symbol of civilization, but also of its breakdown. In ritual, Dionysus's wine induced visions. In drama, his stories pushed people to reflect on chaos, control, and grief. And in myth, wine was his calling card. He didn't just offer drink, he offered altered states of being. And sleep? Sleep is a form of surrender. It's the one universal vulnerability. Even kings must sleep, even gods, occasionally. But in mythology, divine sleep is never weakness. It's potential energy. So Dionysus napping on a pirate ship wasn't an accident. It was a setup, a test, a mirror held up to men who thought themselves untouchable. They failed, and so he changed them. You might think this story ends with dolphins, wine, and a humbled ship drifting back to port, but the truth is more enduring. Dionysus's tale lived on for centuries, not just in temples but in theaters, symposiums, and faded wall paintings. His presence filtered through Roman Bacchus worship, through medieval reinterpretations, and even into modern psychology, where Carl Jung saw him as the archetype of the chaotic unconscious, necessary to balance Apollonian order. In every age, he's a reminder. Not all chaos is destructive. Some chaos is cleansing. Pirates, those icons of lawlessness, thought they were the wild ones. But Dionysus was something deeper, wilder than wild, because he had nothing to prove. He could nap on a ship surrounded by blades and thieves because he knew how the story would end. Today, in the waters around Naxos and Delos, dolphins still leap. Tourists watch them from cruise decks and clap with delight, never knowing that, according to legend, these creatures were once men who dared to tie up a god. It's just a myth, they say, but the story persists. It persists because it speaks to something old in us. The idea that joy and fear, transformation and consequence are always near the surface, like dolphins in the waves, and maybe, just maybe, the god still naps somewhere. Waiting to wake. Waiting for someone to look at him and ask, not who are you, but what am I supposed to learn? So the final question is this. If Dionysus always returns, what part of the world is he waiting to reclaim next? And will we recognize him when he's asleep at our feet? Story 2. Title: The Siege That Forgot to Start. The Curious Case of the Cadiz Expedition. 1625 tale of mismanaged schedules, poorly packed rations, and a fleet that went to war, but forgot what it was fighting for. This is the story of how England's most ambitious naval venture of the early 17th century turned into a floating picnic, complete with spoiled wine, mutinous sailors, and a siege that fizzled out like a wet musket. A perfect lullaby of historical incompetence. You've probably heard of great battles: Normandy, Waterloo, Hastings, glorious chaos, precision strategies, turning points that changed history. This is not one of those stories. Instead, you're going to drift back to a time when England was governed by gentlemen in ruffled collars and oversized egos. It's 1625. King Charles I has just taken the throne, and the English Parliament, eager to prove itself, decides it's time for a bold statement of naval power. Spain is the target, specifically the port city of Cádiz, with its glimmering white walls and sprawling fortifications, had long been a jewel in the Spanish Empire. The English, hoping to strike a blow against Spanish influence and scoop up some lucrative treasure ships, set out with one of the largest fleets they'd ever assembled. What followed was not glory. It was more an extended mistake. By 1625, Europe was already knee-deep in the 30 Years' War, a brutal conflict sparked by a mix of religious zeal, territorial greed, and dynastic rivalry. Every major power had taken sides. Spain, under the Habsburgs, was flexing its muscles across the continent. England, meanwhile, was trying to figure out what kind of power it wanted to be. Freshly crowned King Charles III had inherited more ambition than sense. His father, James III, had avoided military entanglements. Charles wanted to show England was not to be trifled with. Enter the Duke of Buckingham. George Villiers, first Duke of Buckingham, was Charles's favorite. Handsome, confident, and spectacularly underqualified for most of the jobs he held, Buckingham convinced the king that a naval strike against Spain would be easy. It would be fast, clean, and pay for itself through plunder. Parliament agreed because it sounded impressive. So they gave Buckingham money, lots of it, and told him to make it happen. The fleet that left Plymouth in the autumn of 1625 was an impressive sight. Around 100 ships carrying over 15,000 men set sail under the command of Sir Edward Cecil, a soldier with no naval experience whatsoever, and that was the first problem. Cecil had fought on land, mostly in the Dutch campaigns. He was brave, competent, and deeply confused by things like tides, sails, or the difference between port and starboard. Nevertheless, he was handed the entire expedition because of his political connections. The men, meanwhile, were a patchwork of conscripts and volunteers. Many had been rounded up from pubs, prisons, and rural villages. Few had been trained. Fewer had weapons. Fewer still had been paid. As for supplies, well, rations were packed in a hurry. Salt beef, dried peas, beer, biscuits. Most of it rotted before they left harbor. Much of the wine turned sour. Some of it was watered down so severely that sailors joked they were drinking promises. Still, the fleet sailed south, cheering, confident, and unprepared. The plan, such as it was, involved a swift assault on Cádiz. The English would capture the harbor, sack the town, and intercept the Spanish treasure fleet as it returned from the Americas. But almost immediately, things unraveled. Storms scattered the ships across the Bay of Biscay. Several vessels turned back. Some got lost. It took weeks just to regroup. And once they finally reached the Spanish coast, the confusion deepened. Sir Edward Cecil, unsure of how to navigate the shallow waters near Cádiz, ordered the men to land miles away from their intended target. They disembarked, and then sat there for days, in the heat, with no clear orders, no fresh water, and nothing to do but drink the dregs of their spoiled wine and complain. Some officers tried to keep order, but most of the troops simply wandered off into nearby vineyards. They got drunk. They sang songs. They slept in the fields. What began as a siege turned into a spontaneous, unauthorized holiday. The local Spanish militia, alarmed at first, began to realize the English had no idea what they were doing. So instead of mounting a defense, they just waited. Occasionally, they'd fire a few warning shots. For the most part, they simply watched. At one point, the English actually captured a small fortification, but left it unguarded. Spanish forces retook it without a fight. Even the English soldiers began to wonder, are we at war? Or is this just an extended detour? One of the more baffling details of the expedition is that nobody could agree on time. Literally. Sir Edward. Cecil reportedly failed to synchronize the fleet's watches. This meant that coordinated attacks were almost impossible. One detachment might think they were attacking at dawn, while another believed they were late for dinner. A planned ambush was delayed because half the force was waiting for a signal that had already happened. In one case, soldiers stormed a village that had been abandoned hours earlier by Spanish civilians. They reported it as a victory. The only thing truly captured during this campaign was the growing awareness that no one was in charge. The expedition was becoming a slow-motion farce, drifting toward failure like a ship without sails. By the time you reach this point in the story, you may wonder, how does an empire forget how to wage war? And what happens when a navy designed for glory gets lost inside its own bureaucracy? By now, you've settled into the calm, rolling waves of a story where no shots are fired, no charges are led, and no heroism appears to be in sight. Let's return to the shores of Cadiz, 1625. England's Grand Fleet is still anchored, a monument to confusion and ambition. You might expect that after days of sunburnt soldiers drinking spoiled wine in Spanish vineyards, someone would step forward and say, enough, let's actually do something. But this is early 17th century warfare, and things weren't done with urgency, especially when commanders couldn't agree on what time it was. Sir Edward Cecil, the man at the helm of this increasingly embarrassing episode, had a plan. Or at least he said he did. After landing, after failing to besiege anything, and after losing track of half the troops in the countryside, he decided it was time to act. His new goal: march inland and capture El Puerto de Santa Maria, a town not far from Cadiz, known more for its sherry production than its strategic value. It was not a fortress. It had no garrison. It offered no resistance. But it was there. And so the army moved. The soldiers had no maps. Some had no boots. Many were already dehydrated, sick, or still intoxicated from their grape-looting adventures. The march began under the harsh Spanish sun. Uniforms clung to sweat-soaked backs. Rations had run out. Water was scarce. Nobody could explain the purpose of the movement beyond vague gestures inland. Spanish scouts shadowed the army from a distance, watching with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. They didn't need to engage. The English army was unraveling on its own. When the column finally reached El Puerto de Santa Maria, they discovered that it had been evacuated. The locals had taken anything of value and left behind empty barrels and empty buildings. There were no riches, no Spanish soldiers, just rows of casks and the fading smell of fermentation. Naturally, the troops settled in. Some took shelter in abandoned houses. Others broke into wine cellars. Barrels were cracked open. Morale improved briefly, then collapsed again when the soldiers, sick from hunger, sun, and sour drink, began to die. Diseases spread quickly. Dysentery, fever, vomiting, corpses lay unburied in the streets. Officers tried to enforce discipline, but they too were falling ill. The soldiers' response was simple: drink more, sleep longer, and forget the point of the war entirely. Meanwhile, Cadiz, the actual objective of the expedition, remained untouched. English ships hovered offshore. Local Spanish defenses, once terrified, now simply watched the slow-motion disintegration of their enemy. On land, Sir Edward Cecil finally realized that this campaign had become unsustainable. He had over 10,000 sick or starving men. No fort had been captured, no enemy army had been defeated, and the Spanish treasure fleet, the supposed prize, was nowhere to be found. It had been delayed, or rerouted, or perhaps it never existed in the first place. Cecil ordered a retreat, but this too was bungled. The troops tried to march back to their ships in something resembling order. They failed. Units got lost. Supplies were abandoned. Dozens of men died from heat stroke before even reaching the beach. Spanish skirmishers harassed them as they went, picking off stragglers, though mostly out of boredom. When the survivors finally reboarded the ships, they found themselves facing new problems. Some vessels had left. Others were overloaded. sailors refused to take on more passengers without additional payment. Fights broke out. Men fell into the sea. It took several more days to get everyone back on board. The fleet limped back to England with broken masts, sick crews, and absolutely no plunder. You might assume that a failed expedition of this scale would be met with disgrace, trials, and firings. You would be wrong. Sir Edward Cecil returned to England and was knighted. True, many in Parliament were furious. They had funded the campaign with the hope of riches and glory. Instead, they got invoices for rotten meat and wine-soaked mutiny. But Cecil had powerful friends, most importantly, the Duke of Buckingham. Together, they managed to spin the disaster as strategically valuable. It had shown England's willingness to confront Spain, they said. The public, however, was less forgiving. Pamphlets circulated, mocking the campaign. Satirical poems spread through London taverns, recounting the brave retreat from an empty town and the siege of grapes. The soldiers who survived received no bonuses. Most were dismissed without pay. In Spain, the Cádiz incident became something of a joke. Not a glorious defense, but a comedy of errors that underscored just how chaotic England's war planning had become. Back in London, a shadow was growing over King Charles's court. The Cádiz expedition had weakened public confidence. Parliament began asking difficult questions. Why had Buckingham chosen an unqualified commander? Where had the money gone? What had actually been achieved? The answers were evasive, and the distrust lingered. Within a few years, this distrust would erupt into political conflict, setting the stage for the English Civil War. And while the Cádiz expedition was just one piece in a much larger puzzle, it revealed something fundamental. England's rulers were more concerned with pageantry than planning, more focused on spectacle than substance. They had attempted to wage a war on a timetable they couldn't read, with an army that couldn't march and a navy that couldn't sail in formation. And so we're left with this question: was the Cádiz expedition a simple failure, or a warning no one bothered to understand? You are now floating in the long, silent wake of an expedition that achieved very little, and yet somehow managed to leave a stain on an empire. The year is now 1626. The English fleet has limped home. Its men are sick, its commanders are exhausted, and its purpose is uncertain. Officially, this was to be the first great blow in a renewed war with Spain. Unofficially, it has become a case study in how not to wage war, but history rarely ends with the last retreat. It echoes, quietly, persistently. Even the most forgettable failures ripple forward in time. And the Cádiz expedition, mocked, ridiculed, and promptly buried, would resurface in ways few could foresee. Let's look at those echoes. When Sir Edward Cecil returned to England, he brought no gold, no captured fortresses, and no Spanish prisoners. He brought excuses. He claimed the Spanish had anticipated his moves. He blamed poor weather, lack of maps, delays, and, curiously, excessive heat. The public didn't buy it, but the monarchy needed a scapegoat, and Cecil was just expendable. Enough. Though knighted initially, his military career quietly ended. He retired to a country estate, where he spent the rest of his life watching others try to explain his expedition. The real political damage fell on the Duke of Buckingham, George, Villiers the royal favorite. He had selected Cecil. He had lobbied for the expedition. He had convinced King Charles I it would be glorious, and it was not. Parliament demanded answers. Where had the funding gone? Why had no one been held responsible? Why were soldiers dying? In foreign fields for nothing? The king refused to hold Buckingham accountable. He dissolved Parliament. Again, this would not go unnoticed. If you are wondering how a forgotten siege that never happened could be linked to something as monumental as a civil war, the answer lies in trust. The Cádiz failure became shorthand for everything wrong with the Stuart monarchy: its arrogance, its secrecy, its disregard for Parliament. The bungled war effort exposed a system where royal favorites made decisions without expertise, where funds were spent without oversight, and where failure had no consequence. It wasn't just about Spain. It was about the nature of power. The expedition had been financed by Parliament under the promise of transparency and success. Neither appeared. So, when King Charles asked for more money in the years that followed, Parliament hesitated. Then, it refused. In retaliation, the king ruled without them for 11 years. This personal rule period is often viewed as a monarch's last attempt to operate without democratic input. And while many factors contributed to the breakdown of royal authority, Cadiz was among the earliest and most public of them. People remembered. They remembered the thousands of dead soldiers. They remembered the silence from court. They remembered that war, once waged so incompetently, was later erased from official records, as if it never happened. Interestingly, the military did learn something. Quietly, and without fanfare, English military planners began to reevaluate how expeditions were prepared. The Cadiz failure showed them that food mattered more than firepower, that maps mattered more than ambition, and that drunk soldiers could not conquer sober towns. In the decades that followed, English naval organization slowly improved. The UFIC Royal Navy began to transition from a loose collection of private ships to a more professional force. Commanders were chosen with slightly more scrutiny. Supply chains became more robust. Sailing routes were charted with greater care. In this way, Cadiz served as a reluctant teacher. Its embarrassment forced change, not loudly, not immediately, but in the slow, quiet way that history often works. It was a failure, yes, but also a nudge. You might wonder how the Spanish remembered all this. The answer is, they mostly didn't. To the people of Cadiz, the 1625 expedition became a short-lived episode of local excitement. Some abandoned homes were looted. A few skirmishes occurred. But the English retreated before they could do any real damage. For Spain, it was not a war. It was a misunderstanding, and that, too, is worth noting. How one nation's military trauma is another nation's comic relief. Today, if you walk through Cadiz or El Puerto de Santa Maria, you won't find any grand memorials to the failed. Siege. No plaques to mark where the English soldiers collapsed from heat stroke. No statues of Sir Edward Cecil grimacing into the sun. But in British naval records, dusty and often unread, the expedition remains, a line item in a long list of forgotten conflicts. Military historians sometimes cite it in lectures about logistics. Political theorists bring it up when discussing royal overreach. But for the most part, it is remembered only in passing. And yet, its legacy remains, not because of its battles. There were none, not because of its victories. There weren't any, but because it was a moment where an empire stared at itself in the mirror and blinked. So now, as you drift further into the dull, quiet waters of forgotten history, here is a final thought. Is it possible that history's greatest warnings come not from great battles, but from the ones too boring to finish? Story 3. The Clockmaker, who declared war on time. You are now in the shadow of a quiet revolution. There are no swords drawn, no soldiers marching, no cannon, blasts to echo through valleys. But make no mistake, this was a war. A war against confusion, inconsistency, and the stubborn irregularity of time itself. Our scene opens in late 18th century France, just before the Revolution, where a man named Jean-Baptiste Joseph Delambre is pacing through the halls of the Paris Observatory, muttering about the absurdity of sundials and church bells. But to understand why this quiet, spectacled man would one day cause riots over the measurement of time, we must first go backward, into the strange, wildly inconsistent world of pre-modern hours. Because before time could be standardized, it had to be wrestled into submission, and that was not an easy task. Close your eyes and imagine a town square in 1700. The sun is high, the people move about their daily routines, and somewhere nearby, a bell tolls. But what time is it? Well, that depends entirely on where you are standing. In Paris, it might be 1:04 p.m. In Lyon, it could be 12:47. In Strasbourg, possibly 1:19 or 12:53, depending on which church is doing the ringing. In the early modern era, time was a local matter. There were no time zones. Noon was defined as the moment the sun was at its highest point. Solar noon. Every town had its own interpretation. Every village its own rhythm. In France alone, there were more than 200 different local times. Travel between towns, and your pocket watch, if you could afford one, was suddenly wrong. For most of human history, this didn't matter. People organized their lives around sunlight, not seconds. Farmers rose with the dawn. Markets opened when the church bell rang. Life ticked by slowly, marked by natural rhythms. But in the age of reason, this fuzziness began to look less like tradition and more like inefficiency. By the eye. Late 18th century, France was undergoing a revolution, not just of politics, but of measurement. Enlightenment thinkers sought to standardize everything. The meter replaced the foot. The liter replaced the pint. And inevitably, someone asked, why not standardize time? That someone was a collection of astronomers and philosophers, among them the aforementioned Delambre and his colleague Pierre Méchain. These were men of charts and sextants, obsessed with planetary motion and celestial precision. Their proposal? Decimal time. The idea was deceptively simple. Instead of 24 hours in a day, have 10. Instead of 60 minutes per hour, 100. Instead of 60 seconds per minute, another 100. This would make time rational, clean, and aligned with the rest of the new metric system. A quarter of the day? That's 2.5 decimal hours. Half a day? 5 hours. No more confusion, no more odd numbers. The new day would look like this. Midnight. Hour midday, 05 hour evening, 10 hour. Clocks were redesigned. Bells were reprogrammed. Revolutionary calendars and timepieces began to appear in Paris. And for a while, things ticked along nicely. Until, of course, people actually had to live by this new time. The trouble started with the bells. Church bells. For centuries, had marked time using a 12-hour cycle. People structured their days around it. When to pray, when to work, when to rest. Now, with decimal time, those familiar rhythms were shattered. Worse, clocks were expensive. Most people couldn't afford a decimal one. So shopkeepers, laborers, and farmers began to ignore the change, or worse, resist it. Confusion reigned. A baker might open shop at 3:00 old time, but the municipal inspector might arrive at 2.7 decimal time. Deliveries missed each other. Work crews arrived late, or early. Church services clashed with civic meetings. Even soldiers were confused. Orders given in decimal hours were misread or mistranslated. One detachment in Marseille reportedly showed up for drills 10 hours too late, only to be punished for disobedience. There were protests, petitions, complaints filed in every arrondissement of Paris. Merchants were especially vocal. They argued that decimal time made scheduling impossible, and worse, unprofitable. Time, it turned out, was not something easily reformed. And at the center of it all was the clockmaker, the artisan now forced to redesign an entire day. Jean-Baptiste Lenoir, a respected craftsman in Paris, found himself in the strange position of building two types of clocks, traditional and decimal. His clients were confused. His workers complained. No one could agree on what hour it truly was. Orders were canceled. Clients demanded refunds. Some even accused him of treason against tradition. Lenoir wasn't alone. Across France, clockmakers struggled. Decimal clocks were more complex to build, and no one seemed to want them. By 1795, just 2 years after its introduction, decimal time was quietly abandoned by most cities. By 1806, it was officially dead. It had failed not because it was mathematically wrong, but because it asked too much of people's habits. Even revolutions have limits. And yet, here's a question to ponder as you drift toward slumber. What does it say about human nature that we would rather live with inconsistent time than change the shape of our clocks? Now that the decimal clock has been installed in your imagination, let's wind the gears a little further. Because even after the official repeal of decimal time in everyday life, its ghost lingered in quiet laboratories and stubborn institutions. This is a story not of glory or conquest, but of stubborn precisionists, institutional inertia, and the awkward lag between reform and habit. In a world caught between tradition and logic, what happens when you try to live inside a decimal day? Let's return to 1793. Paris still unstable, the guillotine sharp, and revolutionary fever in full swing. Though decimal time had largely failed in public life by the mid-1790s, certain Enlightenment circles refused to abandon it. For astronomers, decimal hours made too much sense. Observations of the stars, Planetary motion and tides were far easier to log and calculate in base 10. At the Paris Observatory, decimal time was retained not out of ideology, but out of sheer mathematical convenience. Converting telescope data, celestial coordinates, and pendulum swings into base 60 was an endless burden. Decimal time for them was like clean laundry. It just made life tidier. Jean-Baptiste Joseph Delambre and Pierre Méchain continued their work, mapping the meridian arc from Dunkirk to Barcelona. Their ultimate goal, to establish the exact length of the meter based on Earth's curvature. Decimal time allowed them to record measurements uniformly and predictably. Minutes and seconds now fell into neat base 10 subdivisions, reducing the friction of their scientific calculations. The irony? While the revolutionary government hoped the decimal day would unify people, its only true legacy was uniting astronomers and surveyors. When Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power, he inherited a country still awkwardly straddling two versions of time. In public life, people had returned to traditional 24-hour clocks. But deep within government departments, especially those focused on science and education, decimal time refused to die. Napoleon was not especially fond of revolutionary fads, but he respected practicality. He allowed some decimal systems to linger in academic and scientific institutions, provided they didn't interfere with the smooth running of the empire. So in 1801, when Napoleon visited the Bureau de Longitude, France's scientific authority, on navigation and timekeeping, he found astronomers still marking events with decimal chronometers. They weren't making a political statement, they simply found it easier. Napoleon let it be, and in one of those quiet bureaucratic moves that history often forgets, France ended up with two systems of time running in parallel, one for the people, one for the precisionists. It wasn't until well after Napoleon's fall that decimal time was finally stripped from scientific use as well. But here's something you may not have considered. A small group of scholars actually tried to live by decimal time. They journaled their days, conducted social experiments, and attempted to adapt human activity to a 10-hour schedule. Let's examine the average decimal day, as proposed by French rationalists. 0. 1.0 early morning, roughly midnight, to 2:24 a.m. in standard time. Shirs, 2:50, morning labor and breakfast. 50, 5 hours, midday activity, the equivalent of around 6 a.m. to noon. 3 hours. 7:50, afternoon work and leisure 7:50. 10 d'ivre, evening meal, rest and sleep in theory. A decimal hour was 144 modern minutes, 2 hours and 24 minutes. That meant lunch at 5-hour decimal time might feel unnervingly late. A 5-minute meeting? Nearly 7.2 modern minutes. Every interaction with a decimal clock involved mental gymnastics. Early adopters recorded disorientation. One teacher at IESI, Paris Lycée, recounted students who arrived 3 decimal hours late to class because their pocket watches still ran on old time. Merchants in Marseille added dual time labels to goods, confusing more customers than they reassured. There were even philosophical debates about what the decimal second meant. Was it closer to a breath, a heartbeat, a footstep? Attempts were made to convert popular songs and Catholic prayers into decimal rhythm. They mostly failed. Even the revolutionary calendar, which divided months into 3 10-day weeks called decades, suffered from poor morale. Workers missed their weekly Sunday rest. Productivity dropped. Riots broke out over the loss of the Sabbath. The decimal revolution, it seemed, was psychologically misaligned with the human body and the human spirit. Despite its failure in public, life, the logic of decimal time, never truly disappeared. In fact, it returned, quietly, efficiently, and without protest, through something else, the railroad. In the 19th century, as steam locomotives shrieked across continents, the chaos of local timekeeping became a nightmare. Every town still had its own version of noon. Train timetables were nearly impossible to standardize. So railway companies introduced railway time, a single fixed standard for their entire network. Eventually, this concept was expanded into national time zones, then international ones. Coordinated timekeeping became essential, not just for railroads, but for telegrams, trade, and military movements. In 1884, the International Meridian Conference set the prime meridian at Greenwich, establishing a new global time standard. Decimal. Time may have died in France, but its desire for consistency lived on in global coordination. The pulse of civilization now beat to synchronized minutes, not local church bells. And ironically, this modern system is far more removed from natural rhythms than anything the revolutionaries proposed. So here's a question to linger in your mind as you fade toward rest. Did decimal time fail because it was wrong, or because it was simply too early? Now you've seen the rise and fall of decimal time, a system born in revolutionary fire, shaped by reason, and eventually extinguished by confusion and human habit. But history rarely erases its experiments. It repurposes them. So tonight, as we drift into the quiet legacy of decimal time, let's trace its fingerprints across the modern world. You'll be surprised where they turn up. Decimal time didn't vanish. It merely took off its wig, stepped out of public life, and quietly nestled itself inside science, global commerce, and even the way your watch ticks. This final chapter isn't about failure. It's about subtle survival. In 1967, the second, the humble, everyday second, was redefined. No longer would it be anchored to Earth's imperfect spin. It would now be tied to something far more stable, the vibrations of a cesium-133 atom. Precisely 9,192,631,770 cycles of radiation would define a second. And what system did scientists use to organize this and nearly all modern measurements? The metric system, which, in its core logic, is decimal. Decimal time, or at least its structural DNA, became embedded in scientific precision. Physics calculations, computer operations, and astronomical measurements all tick forward in uniform decimal increments. In laboratories around the world, scientists don't use 12-hour clocks or base 60 minutes. They work in seconds, uniform, metric seconds. In fact, in fields like astrophysics and quantum computing, time is sliced into nanoseconds, microseconds, and even smaller intervals, all base 10. Not a single duodecimal division in sight. So while decimal time was laughed out of Parisian cafes, it was quietly embraced in observatories, laboratories, and satellites. It lived on in the background. Let's jump forward. Imagine you're an astronaut on Mars. A day on Mars, called a sol, is about 24 hours and 39 minutes long. Too long for a traditional Earth day, too short to call it two. NASA engineers had a dilemma. How do you track time on a planet that doesn't match Earth's clocks? Their solution? Decimal. During the Mars Pathfinder and subsequent missions, NASA scientists used Martian time, where each sol was divided into 1,000 sols seconds, effectively a decimal clock. They even built custom watches for mission control in Pasadena, calibrated to Martian decimals. Every beep, ping, and signal was marked in base 10 segments of sol. So the next time you think decimal time was a failure, remember, it now lives on. In outer space. And that's not a metaphor. It literally lives in mission protocols, rover timers, and the daily rhythms of people operating on another planet. Even in daily speech, the echo of decimal thinking has slipped into our vocabulary. Think of how we measure time when we're frustrated. I've been waiting forever, at least 30 seconds. Give me 5 minutes tops. Be back in 10 seconds. Notice something? We default to decimal chunks of time, not base 60. We say 10 seconds, 20 minutes, 5 hours. Rarely do we say 3/4 of an hour or 1/12 of a day anymore. Even in expressions of impatience or urgency, decimal approximations dominate. In hospitals, heart monitors and dosages operate on decimalized time sequences. In factories, productivity is measured per 100 minutes, per 10-second units, per metric, hour. And in software, every process, from video encoding to game speed, runs on milliseconds and microseconds, not traditional clock hours. Whether we realize it or not, we've slowly adopted the decimalization of time through the back door. Let's, pause for a moment, pull out your smartphone, open your stopwatch, hit start. You'll see time flow, 0000, seconds, tenths, hundredths, all in base 10. It's not revolutionary anymore, it's expected. The decimal time system is embedded into our machines, into our software, into every operating system you've ever used. So yes, France abandoned decimal time. But computers, they adopted it wholesale. And as our world becomes more digitized, with human rhythms increasingly matched to machines rather than church bells or sunrises, decimal time continues to rise from the ruins of revolutionary Paris. It is no longer a revolution, it's an infrastructure. Claude Boniface Collignon, the original advocate of decimal time, died in 1819, largely forgotten. His ideas were dismissed as pedantic. The decimal day was remembered, if at all, as a quirky failure of the revolution. But if he were alive today and saw our labs, our code, our mission control rooms in Houston, he might lean back and smile, because the joke, it turns out, is on all of us. We still live by decimal time. Not in the way the revolutionaries imagined, not with 10-hour watches and 100-minute hours, but in our instruments, our measurements, and our mathematics. It's not visible in the tower clock, but it pulses in the circuits beneath. And so, as you drift into sleep and your internal rhythms settle into their own quiet beat, ask yourself this: has time changed us more than we've changed it? Story 4. The man who tried to weigh the moon and nearly got himself arrested. You may not remember his name, but Jean-Baptiste Joseph Delambre once walked through the streets of Paris with a pendulum and a telescope, and almost got himself killed trying to weigh something no one could touch: the moon. Before satellites, before rockets, even before the word astrophysics was in fashion, there were men like Delambre, half scientist, half philosopher, and always deeply impractical. This is a story about attempting the impossible, about a man who believed reason and measurement could do what no army or monarch had ever done: bring the moon under human control. Not in the literal sense, Delambre wasn't mad, but in the quiet, orderly sense of knowing the moon's mass, its distance, its gravitational influence, because if you could weigh the moon, then you could tame the heavens. But in 1792, during the height of the French Revolution, walking around with mysterious brass instruments, scribbling furiously in notebooks and muttering about lunar density, could get you into a lot of trouble. Let's set the stage. By the late 18th century, Europe was buzzing with data. Observatories collected star charts. Navigators mapped the globe. Inventors tinkered with air pumps and electrical jars. It was the Age of Enlightenment. But for all their wisdom, even the brightest minds had a problem. They didn't agree on how big the world was. This might seem odd to you. After all, we know Earth's radius to within a few meters today. But back then, estimates varied wildly. Even defining the meter was a struggle. The French Academy of Sciences had declared that the meter would be defined as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the equator to the North Pole. But this required a massive geodetic survey across France and beyond. Enter Delambre, a mathematician, astronomer, and geodesist, one of those thinkers who spent hours contemplating the motion of Jupiter's moons, or calculating eclipse paths on parchment. And now, he had a mission, not just to help define the meter, but to use those same measurements to weigh the moon. That's the strange beauty of 18th century science. They didn't just accept mysteries, they devised impossibly clever ways to untangle them. Delambre believed the answer lay in pendulums. Here's how the logic worked. Pendulum swings at a rate determined by gravity. Gravity changes very slightly depending on your location. It's a tiny bit weaker on a mountain, stronger in a valley. If you could measure these tiny shifts with extreme precision, you could estimate how Earth's gravity varies across different places. And if you went one step further, you could measure how the moon's gravity subtly affects Earth's gravity, especially during high tide, or during a lunar perigee, when the moon is closest. With enough readings, enough precision, and enough math, Delambre believed he could estimate the moon's mass by how much it tugged on Earth's pendulums. It was brilliant, and borderline impossible. Armed with a custom-built pendulum rig, Delambre began walking the streets of Paris. He took readings in gardens, churchyards, abandoned towers, and university basements. But this wasn't the serene, pipe-smoking science you might imagine. France at the time was in turmoil. The revolution had decapitated a king. Priests were fleeing, nobles were being rounded up. Anyone carrying strange instruments or staring at the sky was automatically suspicious. And there was Delambre, measuring pendulum swings with brass clocks, writing down lunar coordinates, and asking to borrow rooftops. In one town, a group of locals accused him of being a royalist spy. In another, he was briefly imprisoned for suspicious behavior near a military fort. At one point, he was forced to flee a village where townsfolk had gathered with pitchforks, convinced he was summoning demons with his gravity experiments. All because he wanted to weigh the moon. Despite the interruptions, Delambre's notebooks began to fill. He plotted graphs of lunar elevation, calculated libration curves, how the moon wobbles, and sketched gravitational anomalies. Some of his ideas were flawed. He underestimated how terrain affected pendulum behavior. He overestimated the moon's gravitational tug. But his work wasn't wasted. In fact, it became foundational. His pendulum data helped other scientists, like Pierre-Simon Laplace and later Gauss, develop more advanced lunar mass estimations using calculus and celestial mechanics. Eventually, a better method emerged. By studying the moon's effect on the orbit of Earth's satellites, natural ones like the moon itself or artificial ones later, scientists could reverse engineer the moon's mass with high precision. Today we know. It weighs roughly 7.35 x 1022 kilograms. But that number doesn't appear by magic. It sits at the end of a long line of experiments. And at the beginning of that line, somewhere between the revolution and the guillotine, was a man in a dusty coat watching a pendulum swing. As Delambre's pendulum ticked away, the revolution ticked on. His work helped define the meter, the shape of Earth, and the rhythm of science for centuries to come. But his dream, to weigh the moon using nothing but earth-bound instruments and mathematics, remained elusive. Still, it left a question echoing. Through the observatories and chalkboards of Europe, if we can measure the pull of the moon from here, what else can we measure without ever leaving the ground? Story 4. The man who tried to weigh the moon and nearly got himself arrested. The summer of 1792 was warm, restless, and loud with revolution. In the heart of France, an astronomer named Jean-Baptiste Joseph Delambre was walking with measuring rods and pendulums, scribbling in notebooks, glancing skyward, and attracting all the wrong kinds of attention. Because in the middle of France's most paranoid political moment, where churches were being stripped, nobles hunted, and anyone with a mysterious tool was assumed to be a traitor, Delambre was quietly trying to answer one of the grandest questions ever asked: how big is the Earth? And, by extension, how heavy is the moon? But to get there, he had to measure triangles, thousands of them, across fields, mountaintops, and miles of landscape where soldiers, farmers, and frightened villagers all saw him as the enemy. See, Delambre wasn't just on a moon mission. He was part of a bigger project, the great redefinition of human measurement itself. The French Academy of Sciences had decided to invent a new standard unit of length, the meter. And to define it, they needed to measure a section of the Earth, accurately, precisely, and with no guessing. The plan was this: measure the distance from Dunkirk, in northern France, to Barcelona, in Spain. Use celestial observations to calculate latitude. Define 1/10,000,000th of that polar arc as 1 meter. Delambre was assigned to the northern half of this meridian arc. His partner, Pierre Méchain, took the southern half. But this was no smooth academic field trip. It became, instead, one of the most dangerous scientific expeditions in history. To measure the Earth, you don't walk the full curve. You use geometry. Giant, invisible triangles stretched across hills and towns. Using telescopes and precision instruments, you measure the angles between distant landmarks, then calculate distances using trigonometry. This was called triangulation. So Delambre and his assistants hauled 40-kilogram repeating circles, quadrants, theodolites, and precision clocks across France. They climbed church towers, scaled cliffs, and squinted at mountaintops across the haze. Every measurement had to be triple-checked. Every error could throw off the entire system. But Delambre had a second challenge. At every village, he had to explain why he was building strange metal contraptions, staring into telescopes, and drawing symbols in notebooks, at a time when fear of spies, sorcerers, and aristocratic agents was everywhere. In the town of Essonne, Delambre was arrested. He had set up a survey station in the garden of a local convent. Villagers spotted him aiming his telescope at the sky and measuring shadows, and soon rumors spread he was signaling British invaders. Or maybe royalist insurgents. Or worse. Delambre was dragged before a local revolutionary tribunal. They asked why he carried maps, why he took measurements at night, why he scribbled in cryptic symbols, and why he visited churches. Were they secret meetings? He tried to explain. The mission to measure the Earth, the invention of the meter, the weight of the moon, the service of science. They weren't impressed. He was thrown in a jail cell for several nights. His instruments were confiscated. His books were burned by a mob. Only a letter from the French Academy saved him. A barely legible note declaring Delambre a scientist, working for the good of the people. He was released, bruised but unbroken, and then he started measuring again. Here's the thing. Delambre wasn't just interested in Earth's dimensions. He knew that if you could measure how Earth curved, its shape, its gravity, you could also infer the pull of the moon. See, the moon's gravity tugs at Earth's oceans, causing tides, but it also subtly distorts the shape of the Earth itself. That distortion, known as a geoid bulge, affects how pendulums swing and how the planet curves. Delambre hoped that if he could map these variations across the land, he could estimate how far the moon's gravity reached, how heavy it must be to cause such an effect, and how that mass compared to Earth's. It was slow, painstaking, almost impossibly so. But for Delambre, every number was a prayer, a gesture of order in a world spinning into chaos. While Delambre climbed hills with sextants, another revolution was underway: decimal time. The French Republic had decreed a 10-hour day, with 100-minute hours and 100-second minutes. It didn't last long, people hated it, but Delambre supported it. To him, decimals were the future. Logic, regularity, predictability. All things the moon itself seemed to embody in its silent cycles. He timed his pendulum swings in both traditional and decimal seconds, comparing how each revealed tiny gravitational pulls. In his mind, the moon, the Earth, and human time were all part of one elegant system of motion. But there was a problem. Delambre's pendulums disagreed. At different locations, sometimes just a few kilometers apart, they swung at slightly different speeds, sometimes faster, sometimes slower. And the differences didn't always make sense. Were they caused by mountains, underground densities, lunar effects? The data didn't add up. The math wobbled. He sent his findings to Laplace, the great mathematician of the time. Laplace admired the work, but confessed more data was needed, better instruments, a new generation of scientists. Delambre's dream of weighing the moon directly from pendulums would remain unfulfilled. But his measurements were still priceless. His work defined the meter. His triangle network became the foundation of France's geographic system, and his tables were used for decades by astronomers and navigators. So, now, picture this: an aging Delambre, sitting at a window in Paris, watching the moon rise. He knows its mass now, at least approximately. But he also knows something deeper. That knowledge doesn't come all at once. It comes in angles and pendulums, arrests and notebooks, errors and refinements, in slow inches, measured across hills and centuries. As the moon shines over the rooftops, silent and heavy with its ancient pull, Delambre wonders, if the moon could pull the tides of Earth, what other invisible forces shape us, unnoticed, every day? The year was 1806. Napoleon was emperor now. The guillotine had gone quiet. The revolution had burned itself out, leaving behind a reshaped France. One full of new systems, new measurements, and new scars. Jean-Baptiste Joseph Delambre, now gray-haired and stooped from decades of hauling instruments across ridges and ruins, sat alone in his Paris study. In front of him, stacks of observation logs, fading ink, triangles inked in trembling hands, and dusty pendulums no longer ticking. The dream of weighing the moon, like so many of his dreams, had not unfolded the way he once imagined, but something else had. Out of his expedition came a definition: 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the North Pole to the equator along the meridian through Paris. That became the meter. A new universal standard of length, a symbol of reason, of human intellect triumphing over chaos and tradition. Delambre's half of the measurement, Dunkirk to Rodez, had been completed at enormous personal risk. Arrests, riots, the loss of trusted assistance to illness, accidents, even execution. Yet he had persisted. And the final report, La Base du Système Métrique Décimal, was a massive 4-volume work of tables, calculations, and measured triumph. Published in 1806, it laid the mathematical foundation of what would become the metric system, still used today by almost every country in the world. It was not a glamorous victory. There was no applause, no statues, just the quiet satisfaction of a job finished. The moon, though, remained evasive. Despite all his calculations, every pendulum swing, every gravitational nudge, every tide chart, Delambre could never pin down the moon's mass with the certainty he desired. In truth, he was missing a crucial piece, Newton's constant of gravitation, which wouldn't be discovered for another 50 years. Without it, all attempts to directly weigh celestial bodies were guesswork built on partial truths. But still, Delambre's method had meaning, because what he attempted was profound, to weigh the unknowable using nothing but triangles and logic, observation and belief, in the idea that the world and the heavens above it could be measured by human minds. In his later years, Delambre served as director of the Paris Observatory and, eventually, as the permanent secretary of the Academy of Sciences. He mentored young astronomers. He organized thousands of data points into volumes. He lobbied for public education, for rational measurement, and for the quiet dignity of science. He also went blind. The man who had spent his life staring at stars and moons, who once saw the lunar disk so clearly it shimmered with weight in. His mind could no longer see even the notebook in front of him, but he could still think. In his blindness, he dictated a biography of prominent astronomers, his final work. And in it, we find a curious detail, something he never quite admitted in his scientific papers. A confession that the pursuit of knowledge, though rational in method, was deeply emotional in practice. That to devote your life to measuring triangles across a continent, to stand in freezing wind with a pendulum and a prayer, to risk arrest for the privilege of one more data point, was, in its own way, a kind of love story. Delambre never touched the moon. He never launched a telescope into orbit or stood beneath an Apollo capsule. But in a deeper way, he did what few ever attempt. He measured his own limits, with care, with courage, and with a ruler of his own making. And though the moon remained, to him, a shadowy weight in the sky, it had drawn out the best of his mind, and left behind something permanent. Today, every time a spacecraft leaves Earth, it does so guided by mathematics Delambre helped define. Every GPS coordinate, every satellite orbit, every schoolchild's ruler rests on the quiet labor of men like him. So tonight, if the moon is out, take a moment. Look up. Don't worry about tides or mass or gravity. Just remember a man who once walked across a burning country with a pendulum in one hand and a notebook in the other, trying to weigh the silence above us, and ask yourself, in an age where everything is measured, what remains immeasurable? In the late 18th century, as France tore itself apart and reassembled itself into something entirely new, the roads between cities were no longer safe. Letters vanished. Couriers were robbed. Messages meant for generals never arrived. And amid all the chaos, one quiet man, unarmed, unnoticed, built a communication network so fast, so secure, and so invisible that even Napoleon took notice. This man was Claude Chappe. And his invention? A system of silent arms on towers stretching across the French countryside, known as the optical telegraph. But before the towers came the pigeons. And before the pigeons came the waiting. The long, patient waiting of a boy obsessed with time, distance, and the speed at which a message could cross a nation. This is not the story of a battlefield. It is the story of rooftops, rotating beams, long staircases, and men in coats silently turning cranks. It is a story of how messages move, and how power follows behind them. And it begins, as many stories do, in a quiet village, with a sick boy, a church bell, and the long shadow of the Enlightenment. Claude Chappe was born in 1763 into a family of minor nobility, not wealthy but respectable. As a child, he was prone to illness, often kept indoors while his brothers played outside. He spent long hours staring at the hills beyond the village, wondering what lay beyond them. One winter, a fire broke out in the next village. The bell ringer was late. The warning came too slowly. And Chappe, watching smoke rise from afar, would never forget the helplessness of that delay. He began asking questions that, in hindsight, seem obvious, but at the time, were revolutionary. How long does it take for a message to reach someone 10 miles away? Could it be done without a horse? Could distance be beaten by light? These were not questions a young boy in the 1770s was supposed to ask. But Claude wasn't, like most boys. As he grew older, Chappe became obsessed with invisible communication. He learned about semaphore, the naval system of flag signaling, and wondered if it could be adapted to land. He read about ancient fire beacons, used to warn of invasions in ancient Greece, but thought them too crude. He wanted something more precise. Something that could spell full sentences, not just a binary of fire, no fire. At age 24, Chappe and his brothers began experimenting. They built signal towers on hillsides near Paris and tried transmitting letters, then words, then phrases, using mechanical arms that turned like clock hands. Each angle represented a number. Each number corresponded to a word in a shared dictionary. With careful coordination, messages could be passed from one tower to the next, across tens, then hundreds of kilometers. The signal took seconds. The message took minutes. For comparison, a courier on horseback would need hours. France, and still years from the revolution, barely noticed. But the seed had been planted. In 1793, as revolution swept the monarchy away and the reign of terror began, France found itself in need of fast, secure communication. Enemy armies surrounded the borders. Internal uprisings flared without warning. And political control depended on knowing, immediately, and what was happening hundreds of miles away. The government recalled Chappe's proposal. By now, Claude had refined the system. A tall wooden mast with 3 movable arms. Each position encoded a number. With 196 combinations, the system could spell anything, provided both ends had the same codebook. The National Convention granted him funding. By 1794, the first line was built, from Paris to Lille, 120 miles. North, it had 15 towers, each placed roughly 10 kilometers apart. Trained operators with telescopes and signal books manned each one. The first message? Siege of Condé lifted. It traveled 120 miles in under 15 minutes. France had never seen anything like it. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Napoleon's enemies, both inside France and out, knew that control over information meant control over power. If Paris could receive and issue orders across the country within minutes, no rebellion could surprise them. No general could claim he didn't know. So they tried to sabotage the towers. Operators were bribed. Cables were cut. At one point, rebels even tried to burn down an entire segment of the line. And so Chappe, always 2 steps ahead, introduced redundancies. He quietly employed pigeon messengers, trained from tower to tower. These birds could carry critical instructions in case a tower was captured or cut off. He also built fallback codebooks, so even if a signal was intercepted, without the latest version of the cipher, it would be meaningless. In a curious twist of history, this combination, wood and wire, bird and beam, created the world's first hybrid intelligence system, but it all depended on silence. Stillness, clarity. Each man at each tower had to be perfectly still, perfectly timed, perfectly disciplined. It was a ballet of motionless patience. By 1800, the Chappe telegraph had expanded to dozens of cities, Paris to Strasbourg, Paris to Lyon, Paris to Toulon. Napoleon, then first consul, used it extensively to announce victories, to suppress uprisings, and even, according to rumor, to propose marriage to Josephine from a distance. But Chappe himself remained in the background, a nervous, quiet man prone to melancholy. He lived alone. He rarely smiled in public, and despite the national importance of his invention, he was never entirely trusted by those in power. Why? Because he had built something too powerful. The state feared that one man, in charge of the E system that carried their secrets, might one day use it against them. Chape, for his part, refused to speak about politics. He only wanted to make the system better. But behind closed doors, Napoleon's advisors began to whisper. What if he sends a false message? What if he delays an order? What if he builds a duplicate system we cannot see? And so, as Claude Chape climbed his tower one rainy morning in 1805, preparing to check his newest design, he must have wondered for just a moment, had he built something too fast for its time? Was the line he had drawn across France not of wire or wood, but of speed, something the world was ready for? Claude Chape's invention, the optical telegraph, had stretched its wooden arms across France like a silent skeleton. From Paris to Lyon, Bordeaux to Boulogne, the signal towers marched across ridges and fields, each no more than a flick of black limbs against the pale sky. Inside each tower, a man with a telescope and a set of instructions stared at the next tower, watching for the slightest movement. It was methodical, boring, repetitive, and entirely revolutionary. But like all systems, it eventually met resistance. Not from foreign armies or storms or even birds nesting in its joints. The real threat came from within, from mistrust, secrecy, and the creeping realization that information, once made fast, could never again be made slow. It was no longer a curiosity. It was infrastructure. And infrastructure, Claude was beginning. To learn rarely belongs to its inventor. By 1806, more than 550 stations dotted the landscape. Each line followed ridgelines and high places, with small outposts spaced every 8 to 15 kilometers. Operators lived in Spartan rooms, usually above or beside the signaling equipment. They kept logs, rotated shifts, polished lenses, and memorized signal codes. Messages moved by daylight only. A clear line of sight was essential. At dawn, the first tower would signal readiness. The final tower, sometimes 100 miles away, would blink confirmation minutes later. It was breathtaking. Government orders that once took days could now be issued and acknowledged before lunch. During Napoleon's campaigns, the system was used to relay troop movements, supply needs, and public proclamations. The very tempo of statecraft had changed, time itself was shortened, and yet, something strange began to happen. Claude Chape, who should have been celebrated, who should have been among the most honored men in France, began to feel watched. It began with small things. A postmaster in Reims claimed one of Chape's men had sent a confusing message. A minor official accused him of holding back critical news to test a new cipher. Nothing could be proven, but the suspicions multiplied. Then came the whisper: treason. One anonymous letter to a government bureau claimed Chape was communicating with foreign agents by means of unscheduled transmissions. It was absurd. Claude barely left Paris. He had no political affiliations. He was methodical to a fault. But the nature of his invention, the sheer secrecy and speed of it, was enough to plant doubt. In a world where a simple twist of a semaphore arm could shift the fate of an army, trust became brittle. So the Ministry of War ordered redundant validation. Every critical message had to be sent twice, via 2 separate routes. If the results differed, the line was inspected. The government also quietly introduced their own observers to select towers, reporting directly to the ministry. Claude was not informed. When he found out months later, he grew withdrawn. It was the oldest lesson of innovation. Control rarely stays with the inventor. In early 1808, Claude submitted a proposal for expanding the lines into Spain and Prussia. He envisioned a Europe knit together by silent beams, an international standard of communication that transcended borders. The War Ministry never responded. Instead, they issued a budget review and quietly restructured oversight. Claude was stripped of his independent authority. The telegraph became the property of the state. They called it a logical evolution. Claude called it something else: erasure. He began to suspect sabotage. Operators reported strange errors, signals altered mid-route, logs tampered with. The state dismissed these as human error. But Claude began keeping his own ledger. He rechecked tower alignments. He questioned station masters. He even launched a private inquiry, funded with his remaining savings. In one instance, a message from Paris to Lille had arrived with a single word altered. Approve had become delay. The altered message cost a military convoy too. Days of exposure in hostile territory. And yet, nothing was done. Frustrated and increasingly isolated, Claude returned to an old idea: birds. He revived his pigeon system, not to carry state messages, but to verify the integrity of his towers. Each morning, he dispatched pigeons from known stations with handwritten versions of messages. When the same message arrived hours later by beam, he compared the two. For months, they matched. Then, one didn't. It was only one word. Harmless. On its face. But it confirmed his suspicion. Someone was altering transmissions. Claude brought his findings to the ministry. They were dismissed as unsubstantiated. One official told him politely to stop interfering. It was no longer his concern. On the morning of January 23, 1809, Claude Chappe climbed the steps of the Central Telegraph Tower in Paris. He had done so hundreds of times before. The staircase creaked. The lenses fogged in the winter air. From this height, Paris stretched gray and quiet. He looked out at his towers, at the beams and joints and gears he had imagined into being. Each one now manned by people he did not know, governed by an institution that no longer wanted him there. Single operator greeted him. Claude smiled faintly. Then, at some point later that morning, he fell. The official report called it suicide. A fit of melancholia, they said, overwork and disappointment. But no note was found. And the timing, so soon after his dismissal, left questions. Some whispered of foul play. Others blamed his reclusive nature. No one was punished. No changes were made. Claude Chappe's fall from the tower on that gray January morning in 1809 marked more than just the end of a life. It was the closing parenthesis on a particular moment in history, a moment when beams and gears tried to conquer distance, and when silence itself became a kind of language. The optical telegraph, once his brainchild and obsession, survived him. It continued to grow. It sprawled into Belgium, the Netherlands, and eventually into parts of Germany. The towers marched onward, no longer driven by one man's vision, but by institutional momentum. And yet, as time passed, so did the wind that had once filled their sails. What began as the fastest system in Europe would, within a generation, become obsolete, a relic of wood, lenses, and disciplined silence. But even in decline, it carried one last message. After Claude's death, his brothers Ignace and Abraham took up the mantle of defending his name. They published his notes. They lobbied the government for proper recognition. They emphasized his contributions not just to France, but to the idea of instant communication itself. The state offered a plaque, later a small pension. It wasn't much, but it was something. More importantly, the Chappe brothers worked to preserve the code books and instructional diagrams. These materials, once tightly guarded, were now studied by engineers across Europe. Young inventors looked at the clunky semaphore system and began to ask, what if we didn't need towers at all? The seed that Claude had planted began to sprout in a different direction. Wires, electricity, and something entirely new on the horizon. In the 1830s, two British engineers, William Fothergill Cooke and Charles Wheatstone, began experimenting with electric signals along wires. Around the same time, in America, Samuel Morse developed a system of short and long pulses, dots and dashes, that could be sent along cables. By the early 1840s, the electrical telegraph was real. And unlike Claude Chappe's optical system, it worked at night. It worked in fog. It didn't require hills or towers or men with telescopes. It used wires, invisible but reliable, strung between posts like veins across the countryside. By 1855, France's optical telegraph system was decommissioned. The towers were shuttered. Some were torn down. Others were left to rot in the rain, their arms frozen mid-message. Not even a farewell transmission was sent, just silence. Today, a few of the original towers still stand, moss-covered stone boxes on forgotten hilltops. In certain towns, you can find rusted armatures on rooftops, their purpose long forgotten. Some were converted into barns, others into signal posts for railroads, but their deeper legacy is harder to see. What Claude Chappe introduced wasn't just a faster way to communicate. It was the idea that information could be abstracted and moved independently of the person carrying it. For centuries, communication meant a person traveling, a rider, a runner, a pigeon. Chappe separated message from messenger. He turned thought into code. He gave birth to the networked mind, and with that one leap, from word to number, from sentence to signal, the modern world quietly began. In many ways, Claude Chappe lived and died in the gap between invention and recognition. He was too early, too fast, too quiet. The system he designed required discipline, restraint, and trust in qualities often at odds with the politics of empire. He didn't dazzle with speeches or court popular support. He merely built and waited. And when power took his creation, altered it, and buried his name, he said nothing. In a world obsessed with speed, Chappe's greatest tool was patience. And perhaps that is the most important and most boring lesson of all. Because history, like a signal line, is rarely moved by noise. It moves instead by the steady turn of hands, by those who wait for the right light, and by the uncelebrated labor of those who pass messages and disappear. Story 6. The Lighthouse and the Three Keepers. The wind never really stops on the Outer Hebrides. It just changes tone. Sometimes a distant hum, sometimes a violent scream, but always present. It presses against the cliffs like a hand searching for cracks, and on the westernmost point of the tiny, jagged island of Island Moore, it finds only a tower, a round, pale lighthouse rising out of the rock like a worn candle against the Atlantic. This is the Flannan Isles Lighthouse. Completed in 1899, it stood not just as a guardian against the sea, but as a monument to Victorian order, a place where the light would shine without fail, every night whether someone was watching or not. And then one day, it stopped. On December 15, 1900, the supply tender Hesperus departed the port of Stromness. Aboard were food stores, oil for the lamp, mail from the mainland, and a replacement keeper. The lighthouse had 3 regular men stationed in rotation: Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, James Duckett, the principal keeper, and Donald MacArthur, the occasional third. Weather had delayed the Hesperus several days. No one thought much of it. Lighthouse duty was predictable. Isolated, yes. Repetitive, certainly. But safe, at least by the standards of the sea. A good keeper needed to be steady, quiet, diligent. The job was, by design, boring. When the Hesperus finally arrived at the isle on December 26th, Captain Harvey expected the usual sight. One of the keepers waiting at the landing platform, ready to help tie off the ropes, take delivery of the mailbag, and guide the new man up the cliff path. But there was no one. The landing platform was deserted. The flagpole above the station, which should have been hoisting the Union Jack in welcome, was bare. The relief keeper called out, "Nothing." The men waited, then rowed ashore. Still nothing. They ascended the winding path toward the lighthouse. No damage, no storm debris, no signs of a struggle. Inside, the clock was stopped. The beds were unmade, but not freshly so. A single chair was overturned by the kitchen table. 2 sets of oilskin coats were missing from their pegs. The third remained on its hook. And the lamp, the great lens at the top of the tower, had gone dark. They found the record book near the desk. The last proper entry was dated December 13th. Routine notes, barometer falling, gale warning, lens cleaned, supplies checked. But then came something stranger. One entry, dated December 14th, described a severe storm, though the mainland had recorded no such event. Another entry noted that Marshall had been very quiet, and that MacArthur had been crying. These were unusual remarks. Keepers were rarely emotional, and the logs were typically technical. The final entry read only, "Storm ended." sea calm, God is over all. Then, silence. The Northern Lighthouse Board sent a formal inquiry. It concluded, the men were probably swept away by an unexpected wave while securing the landing gear or crane. It was a plausible explanation. Violent. Rogue waves had been known to hit the western coast, but it didn't fully satisfy. Why was only one coat left behind? Why were the doors locked from the inside? And why had none of the bodies ever been recovered? No definitive answer emerged. Just a lighthouse, empty and undisturbed, where the light had gone out, just once, in the middle of December, and no one could say why. In the weeks that followed, rumors swirled. Some spoke of ghost ships, others of madness. One local paper speculated that the men had fallen victim to a feud, or fled their posts in despair. But none of these theories fit the known. Facts: no blood, no struggle, no signs of flight, only the overturned chair, the stopped clock, and 3 men whose last act was by all accounts to tend the light, and then vanish. What then do we make of a disappearance that leaves everything behind, the lighthouse? Doesn't care if you're lonely. It doesn't care how long you've been awake, whether you've eaten, whether your hands are raw with salt. The light must go on, always. That is the first and final rule of the keeper. And so, in understanding what might have happened on Island Moor in December 1900, we need to understand not just the storm or the logbook or the coats. We need to understand what it meant to live in a lighthouse, not just beside the sea, but inside it. Life at Flannan was dictated by one thing: the turn of the lens. Before the automation of electric motors, lighthouse lenses sat on delicate beds of mercury and were rotated by weighted clockworks. These mechanisms had to be wound by hand, often every 4 hours, or the light would stop sweeping. The beam would no longer pierce the dark, and ships, unaware, would sail blind into the rocks. So the men lived in shifts. Day: weather reports, log entries, oil replenishment, brass polishing, cleaning soot from the lens. Evening: more winding, checking the flame, refilling the fuel. Night: sleeping lightly, one man always half awake, ready to climb the stairs again. Every hour was accounted for, every task written down, every detail logged. Silence wasn't just expected, it was built into the system. Food came every 2 weeks: dried meat, hardtack, potatoes, tinned treacle. Water was collected from rainfall and stored in cisterns below the tower. Communication with the mainland was non-existent during storms. The lighthouse had no telegraph, no radio, just flags and lanterns. If something happened, an injury, a burst pipe, a falling rock, you waited, or you handled it yourself. The nearest soul was on Lewis, some 20 miles east. On foggy days even, the horizon disappeared. There was no village, no visitors, no distractions, only the sea, the stone, and your 2 companions. James Duckett, the principal keeper, had served the Northern Lighthouse Board for more than 20 years. Quiet, reliable, known for his orderliness and exacting standards. Thomas Marshall, second assistant, was younger, but ambitious. He had taken this remote post for a promotion. He was not known to be emotional. Donald MacArthur, the occasional, was not supposed to be on Island Moor at all. He was filling in for a sick colleague. He had a reputation for toughness, a short fuse, and for being deeply religious. Some said he disliked the sea. Others said he spoke to it. None of the 3 had reason to vanish, and yet vanish they did. To stand on the western edge of Island Moor is to feel how fragile you are. There is no gentle surf here, only constant wind and the ceaseless roar of crashing waves. From the landing platform to the top of the cliffs is a steep, jagged slope of stone steps. Above them is the crane used for lifting barrels of oil and water. Around it, open sky and nothingness. In past years, waves had been recorded as high as 100 feet. At least once, a rock weighing more than a ton had been torn from the cliff and flung into the crane house. Could a freak wave, unseen, unannounced, have claimed all 3 men? Perhaps one man went to secure the landing gear. A second followed. The third, concerned for the others, rushed out half-dressed, A single rogue wave could have ended them in an instant, but even this has problems. Wouldn't there have been damage to the crane? Why had no one mentioned such storms from shore? And why were there strange entries in the log, describing tempers, fear, and spiritual unrest? Lighthouse keepers were trained to be calm, professional, dispassionate. They were not to speculate in logbooks. They were not to record emotions. And they were certainly not to invoke religion, except in last rites. The entries on December 14th were not standard. What could make a veteran like Ducat write of fear? What did MacArthur cry about? Had they seen something that eroded their composure? Or had they simply endured too many days without sleep, too many nights of wind, too many hours watching the sea move but never stop? There are thresholds beyond which even the calmest men drift. And what happens then, when all that steadies you, routine, silence, companionship, begins to slip? Back in Stromness, the families waited. The children of James Ducat lit candles. The wife of Donald MacArthur stood at the harbor for days, eyes fixed on the horizon. No wreckage returned. No answers arrived. The tower stood still, and as January turned into February, the North Sea iced over, and the Flannan Isles faded back into myth. The Northern Lighthouse Board kept the station staffed. They trained new men. They told them not to worry. But every man who was posted to Island Moor after 1900 knew the story. And each, in quiet moments, would wonder, what would you do if you were the only one left and the storm didn't end? By the time the final report was filed in early 1901, the official narrative was clear. A sudden squall. 3 men on the rocks. A wave larger than expected. No time to run. The sea took them, as it takes many. But something about it never quite sat right. In the absence of bodies, explanations grow. The first to emerge was the rogue wave theory. Waves on the western Scottish coast can rise in walls, sudden and vast. One man, it's reasoned, left the tower to secure equipment. Another joined. Then the third followed, perhaps against protocol. A wave surged, perhaps 60 or even 100 feet, and the sea erased them. The logic is sound. The location supports it. Rogue waves are real, but what complicates it is this: the state of the lighthouse itself. The lamp had been properly secured. The log had been filled out. Beds were left neatly, unmade. The door was locked behind them. If they had run out in panic, why so methodical? If they had expected to return, why had no one survived? The Outer Hebrides are soaked in folklore. The people who live nearest the Flannan Isles have always held to old beliefs of selkies, sea spirits, and the second sight. Island Moor, in particular, was said to be thin, a place where the boundary between worlds grew narrow. Some whispered that the island was cursed. Others said the men had been driven mad by the wind, by solitude, or by something they saw. A ship on the horizon with no flag. A figure on the rocks that never blinked. In one tavern in Lewis, a rumor spread that the keepers had been taken by the island itself, swallowed into the earth, returned to the sea. One newspaper even ran the headline, "The keepers were taken by the spirits of the deep." But the Northern Lighthouse Board refused to acknowledge such tales. They were a scientific body, engineers, men of rational minds, and yet even they could not explain the final line in the logbook: God is over. All. In the decades since, a quieter, more human theory has taken root. It begins not with waves or spirits, but with the mind. Solitary confinement is known to warp time perception, induce hallucinations, and fray emotional stability. But Island Moor wasn't solitary confinement, some argue. It was worse. It was routine, repetition, silence broken only by machinery, gulls, and wind. 3 men, 2 miles of rock, no trees, no human contact, and above all, responsibility for a single, vital task. Don't let the light go out. Perhaps a quarrel escalated. Perhaps one man fell. The others went to help. A chain of accidents, each one reasonable, each one final. It would explain the missing coats, the stopped clock, the strange entries in the log. Not madness, not malice, just exhaustion, isolation, and one wrong moment. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse continued operation until it was automated in 1971. After that, no keeper returned. The light still burns. It's powered remotely now. Engineers visit once or twice a year, weather permitting. In 2000, a memorial plaque was placed at the base of the tower, to the memory of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, who gave their lives in service of the light and were never seen again. It is a simple gesture. No ghosts, no judgment, only silence. What makes the Flannan Isles disappearance unsettling is not its drama, but its quietness. No wreck. No cries. Just absence. The story lingers not because it's unsolved, but because it mirrors our fear of becoming untethered. From reason, from one another, from ourselves. We imagine ourselves in that tower, keeping time. We imagine what it would be like to realize we are alone. We wonder what we would do when the wind keeps rising, and no one answers the lamp. And maybe, if we listen closely enough, we can hear the question that still echoes from the rocks. What really happened when the light went out? Story 7, The Clerk. Who counted London in the year 1620, if you lived in London, chances are you did not know how many people lived beside you. You didn't know how many were born this week or how many had died. You couldn't know whether the fever in the next parish was serious or merely the usual illness. You lived in a world of suspicion, of bells that rang for the dead, of rumors, passed between markets and taverns, and most of all, you lived in a city without numbers. But one man decided to count, not because he was told to, or because it was his job, but because he was curious. His name was John Graunt. He sold lace for a living. And he quietly invented statistical science. Graunt was not a nobleman, nor a physician, nor a philosopher. He was a tradesman, a middle-class linen draper, born in 1620 in London, baptized at St. Michael Cornhill, and raised amid the noise of bills, bolts of cloth, and customers. But somewhere between counting his stock and reading news sheets, Graunt developed a peculiar habit. He collected death records. These were called the bills of mortality. Every week, the parish clerks, mostly older men who could read and write, posted public notices of the dead, their name, age, parish, and cause of death. By the 1630s, these bills were being printed for sale, sold on the streets alongside ballads and broadsheets. Most Londoners read them for gossip or superstition, but Graunt read them like a map. He clipped them, sorted them, copied them into ledgers, counted things no one else bothered to count. How many died of consumption versus rising of the lights? Were there more deaths near the river than away from it? Did plagues strike the poor more than the rich? No one asked these questions because no one yet believed that numbers could describe society. Graunt, alone, suspected they could. To understand why Graunt's work mattered, you need to understand London in the 1600s. It was a city of filth. Most people lived in single-room homes. Chamber pots were emptied into the streets. Rats ran freely. Wells were shared. Baptisms and burials were part of daily routine. And there was always plague. The Great Plague of 1665 was still decades away. But earlier outbreaks in 1625 and 1636 had already devastated whole neighborhoods. Streets were abandoned. Houses marked with painted crosses. Authorities fled upriver. In these moments, the bills of mortality served one grim function. Warning. If plague deaths jumped, people noticed. If one parish went from 2 to 12 deaths, the baker down the lane would hear. But that was the limit. No central authority kept track. No charts were kept. No one compared parish to parish or year to year, until Graunt did. He began compiling them over years, weeks of parchment stacked in rows. He transcribed not just totals, but categories. Teeth. Rising of the lights. Mother. Planet. Each a real cause of death listed in the bills, each telling a story. What did teeth mean? Infant mortality? What was planet? Likely an astrological term used when a cause could not be determined. The bills spoke a strange language. Graunt translated. In 1662, when Graunt was in his early 40s, he published something the world had never seen before: natural and political observations made upon the bills of mortality. It was not just a table, or a summary. It was an argument, that numbers could explain behavior, that society could be measured, that disease had patterns, that the world had rules, even in chaos. It was the first act of public demography. Graunt estimated London's population at around 384,000. No census had ever been taken. He did it from death records alone. He observed that more boys were born than girls, something still true today. He showed that certain diseases peaked seasonally. He noticed that even when plague waned, certain causes, consumption, dropsy, ague, remained stable. It wasn't just about death. It was about rhythm. Graunt had, in effect, turned London into a living organism and statistics into a new form of seeing. Graunt's pamphlet did not go unnoticed. It caught the attention of the Royal Society, then newly founded and brimming with men like Robert Boyle. Christopher Wren and Isaac Newton Graunt was invited to join. A lace merchant, with no formal education beyond trade, found himself seated at tables with the greatest minds of the century. Boyle praised his method. Wren supported his election. The term political arithmetic was born. In this way, John Graunt did not just count the dead. He gave birth to the idea that a society might be understood from its data, not through poetry or religion or rumor, but through record, through counting. But even now, centuries later, one question hangs in the air. Why him? What made a tradesman, and not a magistrate, look into the hidden patterns of death? What did he see that others missed? And what, exactly? Did the bills whisper to him in the silence between statistics? By the time John Graunt's observations upon the bills of mortality reached the ink-stained desks of the Royal Society in 1662, the reaction was both cautious and curious. Graunt's findings were revolutionary, but not because he claimed to discover anything particularly dramatic. Rather, he had quietly done something the world had not yet imagined. He had turned death into data. And in doing so, he offered something deeply boring, yet deeply useful, a method to see society through its silences. To appreciate the true novelty of what Graunt had done, you must imagine the intellectual environment of the 1600s. Europe was still emerging from centuries of mystical and religious explanation. The plague was often blamed on divine punishment, bad air, or even planetary misalignment. Illness was local, circumstantial, and mysterious. But here was a man using no telescope, no microscope, no advanced theories, just subtraction, multiplication, and a pencil. He did not try to cure the plague or map the stars. He simply asked, who dies, when, and where? Using more than 50 years of weekly mortality bills, Graunt revealed patterns. That more males were born than females, but more females survived to adulthood. That the plague came in cycles, sometimes vanishing, for years, then flaring with sudden terror. That the city grew steadily, even through its crises. That infant mortality was staggeringly high. Nearly 1/3 of all recorded deaths were of children under 5. In many ways, Graunt's true subject wasn't death. It was survival. Graunt's London had no census, no neighborhood surveys, no public health department. But through the bills of mortality, Graunt crafted a crude demographic map of the city. Each death report named the parish, St. Giles, St. Sepulchre, St. Margaret's. And from these, Graunt observed which parishes were most afflicted. He noticed that parishes nearer the Thames often had higher death tolls, perhaps from proximity to trade, waste, and stagnant water. Others were remarkably stable, rarely struck by plague, maintaining consistent death rates even during outbreaks. In his writings, Graunt remarked, the more close and thick-built parts of the city are most subject to the plague. He had, in essence, mapped population density without ever using the term. He showed that data could expose vulnerability, that a city could be diagnosed as if it were a patient. Graunt's work also brought attention to the strange language of the bills. The causes of death were often more poetic than clinical. Rising of the lights, likely a respiratory ailment. Teeth, referring to infants teething, but really indicating infant mortality. Suddenly, unexplained death. Planet, astrological cause. King's evil, Scrofula, a form of tuberculosis. Overlaid, infants smothered in bed, often by accident. Grount didn't mock these terms, he translated them. By grouping and comparing, he created early medical categories, long before standard classifications. He even attempted to distinguish between natural deaths and those caused by social conditions. When many infants died of overlaid, he noted that such deaths occurred more frequently in poorer parishes. It was a quiet accusation. Poverty killed, and the bills proved it. Grount's influence grew quietly. The term political arithmetic was soon coined by William Petty, an economist and Grount's contemporary, to describe this new method of measuring the body politic. Petty admired Grount's modesty. Grount never claimed to solve problems. Instead, he framed new questions. How fast is the city growing? What occupations are most common in each parish? What proportion of deaths are from infectious diseases versus chronic ones? With these tools, rulers and thinkers could make decisions grounded in observation. Petty believed that if such data were gathered across England, the country could be governed more rationally. It was an early dream of technocracy, numbers replacing superstition. Grount had quietly opened a path toward bureaucracy, insurance, public health, and modern epidemiology. John Grount remained grounded. He continued working in his shop, running his business while also corresponding with London's intelligentsia. In 1665, the Great Plague struck. Over 100,000 Londoners perished. Grount's methods suddenly became vital. Authorities consulted the bills of mortality daily. Grount's logic, the idea that the plague had a pattern, helped structure response. Even though no cure existed, officials began to think in terms of containment, timing, and comparative danger. The city was learning to govern by counting, and the man who had taught them had never worn a physician's robe. Grount's later years were marked by difficulty. His shop suffered. He converted to Catholicism, unpopular in Protestant London, and some contemporaries distanced themselves. Records suggest he may have fallen into debt. He died in 1674, his passing largely unremarked, but his book lived on, reprinted, studied. Built upon, every demographer, every census taker, every public health official owes something to John Grount. He was the first to see society as a pattern, one you could only notice by counting its most overlooked moments. A child's fever, a washerwoman's death, a sudden collapse in the street. They were not isolated tragedies. They were data. They were the city speaking. But even as Grount's methods spread, one question remains unanswered. Did he ever imagine that these cold, numerical lists, row after row of the dead, could be the foundation of modern governance? Did he understand that by counting death, he was measuring life? By the early 18th century, the city of London had grown into a teeming machine of humanity. Its walls no longer constrained it. Its map was alive with trade, dirt, prayers, and smoke. But behind the city's bustle was a quieter, far more significant change. People were no longer invisible. Not because someone had seen them, but because someone had counted them. John Grount had passed. But his idea, the concept of understanding society through numbers, had not. His political arithmetic had found disciples. And with each ledger, each tally, each mortality roll, a picture emerged. Not of kings or generals, but of the common person. The world was now being interpreted through a spreadsheet of lives and deaths. After Grount, English authorities realized the bills of mortality could be more than weekly death registers. They could be tools for managing everything, from urban planning to plague control. By the 1700s, new offices were created to analyze data. Parishes were expected to submit more accurate, timely reports. And slowly, the work once done in quiet obscurity by Grount became institutionalized. The state had begun to formalize counting as governance. This was no small shift. Until then, ruling had relied on land ownership, military power, or divine right. Now, power could also come from spreadsheets. Knowing how many people lived in a city, what they died from, what they feared, what they suffered, became a kind of control. And it didn't end in England. Other cities took note. France, Prussia, and the Dutch Republic began similar efforts. Some sent scholars to study Grount's work. Others developed their own versions of mortality bills. Even the Vatican began keeping more precise parish records. A soft revolution was taking place, not of swords, but of ink, political arithmetic, evolved into a full discipline, statistics. The word itself comes from statistic, a German term used in the mid-1700s to describe the science of statecraft. By 1800, governments were not just counting deaths, but births, marriages, occupations, taxes, and more. Statistics departments appeared in universities. Philosophers began applying probabilities to everything, from games of chance to economic risk. The world was being reimagined as a set of probabilities, and while this may seem dull, it was anything but. In fact, it was revolutionary. It meant that no matter how poor, how young, or how forgotten a person was, they still mattered. They were counted. Their life, even if short or ordinary, left a numerical mark. It was perhaps the first time in history that the anonymous citizen gained historical weight. One unexpected outcome of this statistical view of life was the birth of life: insurance. In the early 1700s, actuaries began using Grant's tables to estimate life expectancy. If one could predict the odds of death at a certain age, then one could build a financial model around it. This idea took hold quickly. The first life insurance companies emerged in London and Amsterdam. Wealthy individuals, clergy, merchants, all began buying policies. Not out of fear alone, but because now death was calculable. Grant had turned death into a data point, and now it could be priced. It sounds cold, and perhaps it was, but it also marked a transformation. Where once people believed death was a fate handed by gods or nature, they now began to see it as a manageable risk, one that could be planned. For mortality, once a mystery, became a spreadsheet. With every benefit of counting, there came a cost. As statistics became central to governance, states began to see their citizens not just as subjects, but as data sets. The modern census was born, not to simply count, but to categorize: race, class, income, illness, occupation, literacy, migration. Grant could not have known it, but his gentle curiosity had created a model later used to control entire populations. By the late 1800s, empires were collecting data not just at home but abroad. British colonial officials used censuses in India. French administrators in Algeria counted tribes and regions with the same cold rigor once reserved for plague victims. And in the 20th century, statistical thinking would be weaponized. Totalitarian regimes used censuses and demographic data to target minorities, plan deportations, and suppress dissent. A method born from curiosity had become an instrument of power. Despite all this, Grant remains largely forgotten. His name is absent from most history books. Few people outside the fields of demography or statistics know him, yet every time a city plans hospitals based on population data, every time a government funds schools based on census results, every time a doctor reads a health risk chart, they are working in the shadow of a haberdasher who sat by candlelight, reading the bills of mortality. He taught the world that you could learn from the ordinary, that even the dullest record, if collected carefully, could become a mirror to society. Today, we live in a world saturated with data. We are counted at birth, followed by digital footprints, tracked in health databases and government forms. Grant would likely marvel at it all, but he might also ask, what are we missing? He knew that numbers reveal, but they also obscure. My own data could not explain sorrow. It could not capture love, or fear, or hope. And though he counted the dead, he never lost sight of the living. So perhaps the final lesson of John Grant is this: that behind every statistic, there is a person, and behind every person, a story, mostly quiet, often dull, always significant. And that's the true power of boring history.